Hey guys, let's do narration. This is another one that I always do late in the semester, even though this one I kind of feel guilty about doing so late because it is useful. And it's one that a lot of you have already been using. It's also one that's very, very useful when combined with exemplification. So let's talk about the basic definition. The basic definition is any story by presenting any events in an orderly, logical sequence. Now, the purpose can be the dominant pattern in a lot of types of writing, as well as speeches, and it's basic to human conversation. If you remember back to American literature, a lot of the stuff that you read out of the Age of Reason, the Declaration of Independence, Continental Congress stuff, all of that stuff, all of those speeches, they built around narration and descriptive writing as their dominant form of writing. It can also be used to organize and structure a deeper purpose. Example, you're writing persuasive essays. If you were to write a persuasive essay supporting death penalty reform, perhaps as examples, you might devote paragraphs to the story of a man wrongly convicted in order to appeal to your audience's emotions. Similarly, you're writing your own persuasive essay, and this is kind of the exception to that never use the first person rule, where your own experiences can become grounds for what you're talking about. You always want to be careful, of course, doing that because your own experience can't be the only thing there. You can use your own experience as grounds, but make sure to provide some backing to support why your grounds is an adequate example to what you're talking about. So when you're planning your essay, in college level writing, a narrative is more likely to present a sequence of events in order to support a deeper thesis. Narration is one of those things that can be used very effectively within argumentative writing, especially in order to support the argument that you're making. So let's say you're writing about the perils of credit card debt, and you're not just going to tell your own story about unwise credit spending and how when you were 18 you just wanted that free water bottle, man, and well, things went bad. You want to select and arrange your details to show your readers why having a credit card encouraged you to spend what you didn't have, and this becomes an argumentative essay. So if you're planning this fictional essay about credit card debt, your basics of organization don't change. You have a thesis, you have body paragraphs that follow a Tolman model, and you're seeking to prove, define, compare, all that good stuff. But a narrative lets you as a writer bring in your own experiences as grounds to support your thesis. It's usually best to include as an explicit thesis with a narrative essay. Usually speaking, descriptive writing is the best place to use an implicit thesis where you have a dominant impression that you're trying to make, and narration is the place to definitely use explicit thesis statements. My negative experiences with easy credit have convinced me that a first-year college student should not have that easy access to credit cards. I bought a monkey and I can't get through school. Narratives also require rich and specific details to be convincing. Each detail should help create a picture for the reader. Even exact times and dates and geographic locations can be helpful. You're essentially building this using descriptive writing, which means you need to understand the connotations of the words that you're using. You need to employ imagery, similes, metaphors, personifications to put the reader into your position. So when narratives present a long series of events, when you're planning it out, the sentences can begin to sound alike. It's a good rule of thumb to follow that you don't want your body paragraphs to all start with the same sentence. You don't want to repeat the same word over and over again. For example, she sewed dresses, she milked cows, she fed pigs, she fed calves, she cared for chickens. I don't care. It's predictable, it's monotonous, it's so dull. You want to vary up your sentence structure, and this is generally a good rule to follow, but it becomes a deep, deep trap to fall into with narration. So you can vary this up with your use of descriptive language. So at the end of this presentation, there's a couple of little bits as well as what we've done so far with descriptive writing. If you write a straightforward account of an event, a chronological order is usually the best thing to do. However, if you're writing a personal experience essay or you're writing a fictional narrative, you may want to engage your reader's interest by playing with order. Maybe you start your essay with an event from the middle or even the end, and then throughout your essay you pepper out events that lead up to it. You could even begin in the present day and employ flashbacks throughout your essay to tell the story. This is probably a good point to point out to you that when you're planning a narrative, when you're planning an essay that uses a narrative in that case, you don't want to just put it in once. If you're writing a 3,000 word essay, you don't want to have one narrative paragraph and then the rest of it's all something else. It sticks out like a sore thumb. If you're going to use narrative, it's best to use it more than once. It's best to refer back to the same story, to present different aspects of the same story as you go through your essay. Present details from that narrative that helps support your point that you're going to at that moment. So when you're using narrative, verb tense also becomes doubly important. Now, there's general rules of thumb to follow. I've been using that word a lot today, rule of thumb, but it's true because there's no such thing as a hard and fast. But generally speaking, verb tenses have a place. And for example, in a literary analysis, the rule of thumb is to use all present tense. In an argumentative essay, the rule of thumb is when you are talking about your own argument, you use the present tense. When you're talking about things that happened before your argument, you use the past tense, and so on and so forth. Now, in a narrative, the verb tense becomes even more important because the verb tense indicates temporal relationship of all these events that you're talking about together. So you have to make sure to keep your tenses consistent and employ them to indicate a sequence of events. I have a sample sentence here. She could not avoid a speeding ticket because she had been speeding. Now in this case, past tense, she could not, is there, but we also have something called past perfect to indicate a temporal relationship. All I mean by that is that, and if you know other languages beyond English, you get a little bit more of a concrete feel of this. All languages use multiple types of past and future tense. There's always past imperfect, which is just something has been happening in the past. He had been cheating on his taxes, versus something that had happened very specifically at a very specific point of time, which is something that happened at a definitive point. And you want to make sure to define those two, as well as define which happened first within your past tense. So in the case of this, she could not, specific time, because previous to this, she had been speeding. It indicates a temporal relationship. We also have, of course, using transitions on page 86 and page 43. On page 86, it gives you some good ones. First, second, next, then, later, at the same time, meanwhile, all that good stuff. Grammar and context on page 88, which is a wonderful little bit on run-on sentences, and some of you are so bad at run-on sentences. And then on page 89, we have a student writer on narrative essays, and it's called My Field of Dreams. So it is a good read. And of course, lastly, at the end, we have the wonderful little visual argument and what is the narrative in that. And it actually comes from a very, very good comic book, which I highly recommend you read. The citation for it is in the book. And then we have an activity. It's fun. The end. We've already seen this narrative in action a lot of times, but we haven't really drawn attention to it. Now, depending on what year you're reading this in, we may have read all of these, some of these, or maybe only one or two of these. I almost always use the black table is still there, in which the narrative is our writer's experience in middle school and then as an adult going back and looking at his lunchroom. We also have I Want a Wife, which is a woman talking about her experiences as a wife. The Wife Beater, which is a definition essay of what that shirt is. I'm Your Teacher, Not Your Internet Service Provider, which is all about the woman who teaches the online courses. Panacea, which is a great narrative about a woman making gravy for her children. And then we also have the Gansberg article, 38 Who Saw Murder and Didn't Call Police, which is all about the murder of Kitty Genovese. On dumpster diving, and then finally Earth Without People, which posits a future Earth without people and what would happen to it. Again, narrative is used in action several times. Even if we haven't drawn attention to it, it's there. It's kind of like exemplification in the sense that it's often a background noise. And then finally, again, narrative employs the use of description to further its purpose. Descriptive writing in general is useful. If you're using narrative, especially a first-person narrative, you want to give your reader a reason to care about your own personal I think and I did this point of view. So descriptive writing can often do that to create a dominant impression to support your thesis. And this is, of course, again, you tell your readers about the physical characteristics of a person, place, or thing. You utilize the five senses, and you pull the reader into your narrative through the use of word connotations. Why use the word ran when you could use the word bolt to describe your dog running away, for example, right? Imagery is often used, figures of speech, and it creates that painting of a picture mood, which you've probably learned about so many times over and over again. It's a great creative form. Description, of course, the dominant impression. You describe elements for details that support your thesis or convey that dominant impression. And again, you also rely heavily on the use of connotations, the associated images, feelings, or ideas. This doesn't mean that you rely on analyzing another writer's connotations, although, again, for a literary analysis or something like that, you often do that. And even for some of your persuasive essays, if you're talking about an interview, maybe the word choice of a person you're interviewing or the word choice of a person whose interview you're reading, maybe the connotations are important. But more often, you're relying on your own use of connotations.